looking at the audio quality right now. Anyways, let's get started. I have about an hour to finish this and then 40 minutes before my alarm goes off for my medication. So let's see how much we can get in. Hello, my name is Isis and this is IsisSaysHi. I like to make a lot of research videos about topics that matter to me. Sometimes I ramble and sometimes I vlog. So if you like any of those things, please feel free to subscribe. And let's get into the video today. Today we're going to be talking about Kitty Genovese and the bystander effect. And the way that I want to present this is focusing more on the victims, one of which was Kitty Genovese, and talk more about them and then go into the bystander effect. Catherine Susan Kitty Genovese was born on July 7th, 1935 to Italian-American parents Winston and Dronelle Genovese, who ran Bay Ridge Coat and Apron Supply Company, and Rachel Ney, I never know how to say that, Petroli, who was a homemaker. She was raised in a 4-family house in Park Slope, which is in Brooklyn, New York, and that was a neighborhood at the time that was well known for housing Italian and Irish families. From an early age, she was known to have a really big energy and zest for life. She was also known as a chatterbox. Her favorite subjects were English and music. She had attended Prospect Heights High School, and that was an all-girls school at that time. I don't know if that changed, and was elected class cut-up, which I'm assuming is like class clown or something, like the class joker, among her graduating class of 712 students in 1953. In 1954, her mother had actually witnessed a really horrifying murder, and so the family packed up and moved to New Canaan, Connecticut. But Kitty chose to stay for many reasons. One of them was that she was getting ready to marry Rocco Anthony Fazolaire. She really loved the city, so she had stayed with her grandparents and was preparing to marry Rocco. They married October 31st, 1954, but 2 years later, they had annulled and divorced, which was in 1956. So after her divorce, or annulment, she had actually moved to an apartment of her own in Brooklyn, and she worked as a bartender after she found working as a secretary to be way too boring for her. In August of 1961, she was actually arrested for bookmaking, so making bets on horses. She and her friend Dee Guarnieri were taking bets on horse races from bar patrons, and they were fined $50, and she had lost her job at that bar. Then later on, she found a new bartending job at Ev's 11th Hour, and that was in Hollis, Queens. And because she always worked double shifts, she made a lot of money, and she eventually became the manager, filling in for the absentee owner who barely ever came in. Gotta love those kind of people. She made about $750 a month, which is about $6,800 a month today, which is insane. And she was saving this money to fulfill her dream goal of opening an Italian restaurant. She was pretty much an independent woman, and every single time when her father would ask her when she would settle down and find a husband, she said, "No man could support me because I make more than a man." I'm pretty sure she was also gay. That could be another factor. On March 13th, 1963, she had met Marianne Zelanko at Swing Rendezvous, which was an underground lesbian bar in Greenwich, or Greenwich Village. I never know which one is correct, and I've lived in New York for quite some time, pretty much my whole life, but not New York City. So that's my excuse. The two fell for one another and ultimately decided to move in together, at least the guy friends, in a documentary that her brother did called The Witness. It's on Netflix if you want to watch it. A lot of the co-workers who were guys knew that she was gay, and her family also kind of knew that she was gay, but it was more of, I know, but I don't want to hear it. When they decided to move in together, they actually found an apartment that was in Kew Gardens, Queens, and it was like a 2-story Tudor-style building, and it was on Austin Street, and right next to it was the LIRR, which is a Long Island Railroad parking lot, and it was pretty much considered really quiet, safe place to live. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor. On the bottom floor was pretty much all of the stores that were existing in the area. They lived a pretty quiet life for the time that they lived together. Crime rates were still pretty low, so much so that a lot of the neighbors left their doors open, and there were kind of some burglaries, but not enough to like really go crazy. I always never understood the leaving the door open. At my university, we had a burglary, and the guy finally got caught, but we had like a burglary. This guy opening apartment doors because so many people left them unlocked. So much so that they literally had to send out an email like a couple of times being like, hey, don't leave your door unlocked. Because yeah, it's a bit weird, it's a bit odd to like leave your house door unlocked with all your possessions. There also was a bar called the Old Bailey Bar that was by their apartment, and sometimes a loud drunk would stumble out, but for the most part it was pretty quiet and safe. Because it was pre-Stonewall, pre-gay rights in that way, a lot of people knew Mary Ann Zalanco and Kitty Genovese as roommates, not girlfriends. So we're going to talk about Kew Gardens and kind of the interaction with the police at the time, but also just police in general. We talked about Kew Gardens and how it's pretty quiet and it was pretty well kept. Its streets were shaded by tall oaks. It was just like a really nice, picturesque little kind of suburban neighborhood. It was also the time where the 911 emergency phone number didn't exist yet, and police weren't necessarily citizens' friends. Sometimes you can call a central dispatcher if you have an issue, but sometimes the response you would get was very mixed. The central dispatcher at that time had worked within the police department, so sometimes they would tell you to just mind your business or move out. I know for one situation, I'm gonna get into it later in the story, but the guy said that there was a shift change, so they couldn't let anybody leave, which is insane to me. Like, I don't freaking care. The police were not the greatest at the time. I don't know, that's for the judge. The police were not the greatest at the time. A lot of the time people would have to like go into the yellow pages. I feel like some people don't know what yellow pages are, and I'm not gonna shame you for that. Be happy that you have Google. Usually had to go into the yellow pages to search up the police precinct that was closest to their house and call. And yeah, you would just really hope that they would actually take your report and go out and investigate, but 9 times out of 10 they wouldn't. There was also a really elegant 10-story apartment building called the Mowbray, and there is a reason that I bring that up. So now we're going to talk about the night of the murder. So Kitty had actually, I think it was either she went to dinner with a male friend before work or after work. She did the night shift. Usually she would get home at like 3 in the morning, and usually it was pretty quiet on the block, and she was pretty okay with like, getting home that late because usually nobody's around, nobody's awake. She was actually really excited because it was actually the 1-year anniversary of her and Mary Ann being together. There was somebody who was following behind her, and she heard the footsteps and she ran. She tried to outrun him and she didn't. So the first attack happened on Austin Street. So that was kind of where all of the stores were, the bar, and where the Mowbray was. The issue was that all of the stores were closed, even the bar. So when he stabbed her, I believe the first stab was in her lungs. So she did scream. She said, "Oh my God, I've been stabbed," but it's unclear of whether or not people actually fully heard her because she was stabbed in the lungs. A neighbor, Robert Moser, who lived in the Mowbray, had opened his window and yelled, "Let that girl alone," and the attacker left. The attacker fled. So Kitty then got up and was stumbling. It's unclear of where she was trying to go at first. There's maybe the thought that she was trying to go to the police box. There's also the other thought that she was just trying to get to some place to get some help, but all of the places were closed. Eventually she ends up in the hallway of her apartment building, and that's where her attacker finds her the second time. Now in the hallway, nobody is really there. It's kind of like I believe it was like a stairs down to the apartment to get in. So you're going down the stairs behind everything and you're trying to get in. So nobody would have actually heard the second attack. And the first attack, of course, it was so late, it wasn't really thought of that anything was wrong. So about 10 minutes later, as we talked about, she was in her apartment hallway. Her attacker found her again and proceeded to finish the job, stabbed her and, trigger warning, raped her, and stole $49 from her wallet, which actually her girlfriend had given to her for Christmas. And of course, because Genovese's lungs had been punctured, she wasn't really able to scream when her murder had returned. And somebody did see, and we'll get into that. She was found by her neighbor, Sophia Farrar, who screamed for somebody to call the police, and she stayed with her, telling her help was on the way. Sophia was the last person that Kitty had seen. They had rushed to the scene, put her in the ambulance, and I believe it was either on the way to the hospital or at the hospital she had succumbed to her injuries and died. She was buried 3 days later in New Canaan, Connecticut. And the biggest part of the bystander effect, or bystander apathy, whatever you want to call it, and the biggest part that was thought of with Kitty Genovese's murder was that everybody saw and everybody heard, but nobody really wanted to do anything. And bystander effect kind of talks about that, where the more people that exist, the less somebody is actually going to be helping. And depending on what the situation is how people decide whether or not to help. So in the New York Times, which we're going to get into later, they said that there were 38 witnesses and nobody just helped. It was just Sophia, pretty much, who was the only hero. And there was one other person who said, I didn't want to get involved. And that is actually what was the spin-off for the bystander apathy or effect, whatever you want to call it. But that's not true. There were not 38 witnesses. There were more like 10 or 12. So one of the first witnesses is Carl Ross. Now, he was the one who lived right up the stairs from where Kitty was being attacked, and he saw pretty much the whole second attack. He was drunk. He was really confused about the noise that was happening, so he had opened the door and saw that, and he was terrified. So he had called his friend who lived in Nassau County. The friend said not to get involved. He called his neighbor, and his neighbor said, come to my apartment. So he went to his neighbor's apartment, and I think his neighbor had told him also to not get involved, but then they called Sophia, and Sophia was like, hello, please call the cops. For context, Carl Ross was Kitty and Mary's friend, but Carl Ross was also gay. And again, as I said before, cops at that time especially were not marginalized people's friends. There is a bit of an understanding of the fear that Carl Ross had. When Carl Ross was actually asked the next day, the day after Kitty's murder, or sometime during the investigation, he had said, I didn't want to get involved. That's why, even though he literally was a person who saw everything, well, the second of everything, he didn't really do much. And Marianne had actually said that probably the last person that you would ever want to see you getting attacked was Carl Ross, because he was such a timid individual. I understand. I think she said that partly as like being angry that he didn't help. When I think about Carl Ross, I also get annoyed that he didn't do anything, and he literally asked 10 million people before somebody told him like what to do. So I get annoyed because he was looking for the answer, like he was looking for permission in a weird way to get help. But I can also understand in those times there weren't a lot of like things that could make somebody feel comfortable enough to want to call the cops. I just hate that he really didn't do much, and then his response was, I didn't want to get involved, because it just sounds insensitive. Like, she's your friend, you don't want to get involved with your friend? Like, hello? Carl Ross also thought that the murderer didn't see him, but the murderer did. And the murderer was like, oh, this person's not gonna do anything, and just continued to rape and kill Kitty, which is the amount of things. It was nuts, and we're gonna talk about the person who murdered her as well. Next is Sophia Farrar, pretty much the only person who was actually brave and did more. She was like really short. She was heterosexual. I believe she was a single mom or just a housewife, but she was definitely a mother. She was the one who yelled pretty much at Carl and the neighbor to call the cops, and she ran down to stay with Kitty and comfort Kitty until help came. There was Joseph Fink, and he worked in the apartment building that was across the street, and he actually saw the whole of the first attack, and he had remarked, it was really weird, but he had like said something about like seeing the attack, like the whole of the first attack, saying I would have gone downstairs and got my bat to like, I guess, go and defend Kitty's honor. But instead of doing any of that or even calling the cops, he went downstairs and took a nap. Then there's also the police, who were just as unhelpful. A few witnesses claimed to have called the cops because they heard that screaming, and at the time the cops either had said, you know, this is a lover's quarrel, don't get involved, not a big deal, because at the time intimate partner violence wasn't seen as a huge deal. So part of it was that the people were given the response of, this is a domestic quarrel, mind your business. The other one was, there was a lady who I believe her main language was French, and she was, I think, an air stewardess or something. English was not her first language, and she had called the cops saying that she thinks somebody is hurt, thinks somebody got stabbed, and it was a lady. And the cops had actually interrogated her so much on the phone that she actually got anxious and hung up the phone. There are a couple people who actually did say that they called the cops, but the issue is that there is no record of that. It's either that people were trying to make themselves seem better. When you get a story sensationalized like that, you want to not look like a jerk, or the cops did delete those logs because I wanted to seem better. And now we're going to look at the murderer's account, and the murderer's name is Winston Moseley. Winston Moseley had actually left his wife, his 2 kids, and 5 German Shepherds in the middle of the night, traveling around looking for apparently a white woman to kill. Just kind of sitting parked in his white Corvair. He was about to pack it up and go home until he saw Kitty in her red Fiat driving. He made a U-turn and followed her to her home, and he ran after her and stabbed her the first time. When he heard the first person say, "Leave her alone," he had actually run away, sat in his car, parked his car somewhere else, changed his hat, and went to go looking for her because he wanted to finish the job. He found her, stabbed her, raped her, and stole $49 from her wallet, and he actually took that wallet and had put it in the weeds somewhere by his job. He also made it seem like the rape and the burglary were kind of just like an afterthought. The murder was definitely something he wanted to do. So again, first attack happened on a really public place. There were no street lights on Austin Street. It was pretty much 3 in the morning, so people didn't fully know what was going on, which is why a lot of people thought it was a domestic quarrel. And even though there was one person who had, called out for her to be left alone, not much was gonna get done. And then again, the second one happened like in a really private corner, and so he had even more privacy, and there was only one person who actually could have come and help, and he knew automatically that that person wasn't gonna come and help, which was Carl Ross. The time frame after this is a bit confusing, but the investigation happened. I think it was around 3 or 4 in the morning when they had knocked on Marianne Zalonko's door, had let her know that Kitty had been murdered, and she had to go to the morgue by herself to identify her body. A little bit later, the cops had come again to question her. She was actually drinking with Carl Ross, soak up the sorrows and the grief. Of course, Carl did not tell her that he saw and did nothing. Detective Mitchell Sang realized, I guess, that Carl was gay, had really pushed Carl to leave, and Carl got so angry that he kicked a door, and then, of course, he got arrested for disorderly conduct, and he was also, I believe, the first or second person to be interrogated, and after that he had left and skipped town. So later on, the homicide detectives John Carroll and Jerry Burns had arrived, and I don't know if they interrogated her at the apartment or at the precinct, but they interrogated her for 6 hours because they figured she was a prime suspect. They figured that she had put out a hit on Kitty and had grilled her about them being roommates until she finally had to admit that they were actually girlfriends, and then it took a very awkward turn. They accused her of getting mad that Kitty was cheating on her with a man, and so that's why she put out a hit on her. And then they also asked about their sex life, which is also just incredibly weird. Either way, they didn't really get much out of her because she didn't do anything. Finally, they actually did find the actual killer, which was Winston Moseley, and he was actually in the middle of stealing a TV. Actually, one of his neighbors had caught him stealing the TV, and that was about 6 days after the murder. I guess he was either getting questioned or interrogated by his car, and the cop had realized that a lot of the witnesses who had seen or had heard about Kitty's murder had talked about there being a white car, and so they brought him in and interrogated him, and they didn't really have to do much because he was just willing to admit all of it. Also admitted to killing Annie Mae Johnson and Barbara Kralik, if I'm not mistaken, and the details for all 3 of the murders pretty much lined up perfectly, but he was only found guilty for Kitty's. Barbara was 15 and was raped and killed. Annie Mae was 24, she was black, a housewife, and was raped and killed. Kitty was 28 and was raped and killed. So I don't know why he was only found guilty for Kitty's. The issue with Barbara was that somebody else was actually already found guilty, and even though Winston had testified at that trial the first time that he was the one who did it, the first trial ended up in a hung jury, and then the second trial, good old Winston decided to recant the fact that he killed them, even though he gave so much detail into what he did. For some weird reason, they found Alvin Mitchell, who's a white teenager, guilty of manslaughter. He got I think either 2 to 6 years in prison. Maybe the cops and the prosecutors at the time were just lazy. I'm so confused by that. In the trial, Winston was tried and he was found guilty for Kitty's murder, but not Annie Mae's murder, and I wasn't actually able to figure out if justice was ever served in any kind of way for Annie Mae. I forgot to say, Winston Moseley is the longest serving inmate in the New York prison system. So So Annie Mae Johnson was, I believe, the second person that Winston Moseley had killed, and it was actually 12 days before he had killed Kitty Genovese. She lived in the same neighborhood as him, but she was 24 and a housewife and a black mother, and she just had the misfortune of being the person that encountered Winston Moseley. He had shot her 6 times and raped her, and for some reason they didn't find him guilty or just didn't prosecute him for the murder. And even the person who had sensationalized Kitty's murder had admitted that if Kitty was black, like Annie Mae, he wouldn't have paid attention to it. So now we're going to talk about Winston Moseley. So I'm going to say, as I have kind of didn't get to say, but trigger warnings for this whole video because it's pretty bad. Winston Moseley was also 28, so the same age as Kitty, and he was actually steadily employed, had a house, a wife, and 2 kids. He was punching data cards for a business machine company, didn't have any criminal record. Of course, we talked about the 5 German Shepherds. He really had no reason to do any criminal things, but he still broke into houses and stole TVs, raped women on several occasions, and killed and raped 3 women. When he was describing the crimes that he did, he was so calm and so functional, and they were trying to get the insanity plea so that he could be sent to a psychiatric hospital, but it just didn't work out. They just sent him to regular prison. And even though pretty much they found him guilty of all 3 murders, they still only charged him with Kitty's. And again, one of the biggest reasons that they knew that Moseley had killed Barbara and Annie Mae Johnson was because he knew so many details from those murders that weren't released to the public, but for some reason he just wasn't found guilty for them. And I couldn't really find information on why. So now we're going to go into a bit of what happened after Kitty's murder outside of the trial. Lights were put in because, as I had said before, it was pitch black in Kew Gardens, especially on Austin Street. People are hearing noises but don't really know where it's coming from, and it was 3 in the morning. I believe it was just throughout New York City. They also created like Neighborhood Watch, a national 911 system. There were also other kind of reforms like crime victim compensation and sex offender registries. So initially, they had actually posted about her murder, but I think it was like a paragraph about it and kept it moving. But Abe Rosenthal was the editor-in-chief of the New York Times at the time, and he sat down with the then police commissioner who was worried about the civil rights movement. Then he talked about Kitty's case, but I feel like he mixed up the facts because it seemed like there were 38 witnesses in a different case, but not Kitty's case, but it was thought to be 38 witnesses. And then if it wasn't 38 witnesses, it was 38 police reports that probably were seen. But he talked about Kitty's murder pretty openly, talked about Winston, who confesses to the murders and confessed to a murder that somebody else had already confessed to, quote unquote confessed. 2 weeks later, he had directed Martin Gansberg to do the story, and Martin Gansberg had released the story. I believe it's called 38 Who Saw Murder and Didn't Call the Police. Of course, later on in 2004, 2007, and 2015, the New York Times had, I don't know if they apologized, but they had corrected the facts of Martin Gansberg's article, but you know, damage had been done. So because of the virality of this article, a lot of psychologists had decided to start to chime in, and that's how we get into the bystander effect. But I definitely want to make it clear that it wasn't literally probably until like almost 40 years later that they clarified that they were wrong. And Abe Rosenthal still thinks that he was good. He still thinks that he did a good job. He had kind of mentioned his sister dying because his sister had been flashed, and because she was so scared she ran home and she got a head cold and died, or got pneumonia and died. And so he kind of tries to align Kitty's murder with his sister's murder, but there weren't 38 witnesses. There was only 12 for the most part. In what's documented, only 2 had called the police. A lawyer, Mr. DeMay, he had created a blog called oldkewgardens.com, and he had actually investigated Kitty's murder and the details of her murder and actually reenacted it himself. And he said that the 2 attacks that occurred, one was way more public than the other. So of course, they're gonna hear the first one, but not the second one. Secondly, she was punctured in the lungs, so it's very uncertain as to how loud she was even able to scream, if she was able to scream at all. It was 3 in the morning, so they wouldn't really hear that noise. And when some people were able to make it to their windows, all they saw was just like a young girl stumbling around. So they also probably thought she was drunk. And again, the second attack was really narrow. It was in a really private place, and there really would only be 1 witness to that murder. Mr. DeMay also believes that a lot of the police calls weren't recorded or were deleted somehow, because he believes the claims that like witnesses wouldn't just leave a woman, especially a white woman, to just die like that. So now we're going to get into the bystander effect, which came from Kitty's case, Kitty's murder. This is the idea that when faced with a horrible event, people will not act or help, but they would instead watch, and then witnesses are less likely to help a victim if there are other witnesses because of the belief that someone else is bound to step up first. And this was created by two social psychologists, Bibb Latané and John Darley. A bystander progresses through a 5-step decision-making process before intervening in an emergency. So first they have to notice that something is wrong, which, yeah. Define the situation as an emergency, which, yeah. And decide whether or not they are personally responsible to have to act. And then they have to choose how to help, and then they have to implement that helping behavior. They also identified 3 different kinds of psychological processes that might prevent a bystander from helping a person who is in distress or in an emergency. The first one is diffusion of responsibility, so kind of thinking there's so many people, so I don't really have to help. The second is evaluation apprehension, so the fear of being publicly judged for trying to help. And then pluralistic ignorance, that is the tendency to rely on the overt reactions of others to define whether the situation is an emergency or not. I think in other situations where the context is really hard to read, yeah, I totally think that these are things that would happen. I think people were very harsh and really hard on some of these people. Emphasis should have been on the infrastructure. Why is it that somebody has to call like a central station to get somebody, and why is it that cops are lazy? Why is it that they're not actually keeping people safe? You really need to think of the context, who the person is, and what's going on, because I think with this is what happened. Let's move on. Viewer discretion. First off, in 1968, he's in jail now. He jammed a Spam tin can up his butt, like all the way up. So far up that the doctors at the prison couldn't take it out, which he had hoped for, and so he had to go to the hospital to get it taken out. I don't know if it was en route to the hospital or after getting it taken out at the hospital, but he was able to escape, and he ran to an abandoned house and stayed there. He found that the phone and the cable worked, so he pretty much stayed there for 3 days, eating food, watching TV, and then he had called a maid cleaning service. I think he had also found that from the yellow pages. She was presumably black or a person of color, and he had raped her. After he raped the maid, he said he would kill her children. He would find and kill her children if she ever told anyone. And she had left and ran away. She was afraid to call the cops. She was able to actually find the homeowner who lived there, their phone number, and said, hey, something weird is happening at your house. The homeowner, which was a male, called the cops to ask them to do kind of like a wellness check on the house. The cops said, there's a shift change. Sorry, we can't do it. 3 days later, the homeowner and his wife came back to check on the house to see. They ended up being bound and gagged. And again, viewer's discretion, trigger warning, Winston raped the guy's wife in front of him and took a gun. So he then stole the homeowner's car, and he took a woman and her daughter hostage and raped, I think, the woman, not the daughter. This is where it's confusing. And then I think he left them and then took other people hostage. I'm very confused about if this was the same or two different situations, but he did take people hostage, and he lets one of the women go. The woman calls her husband, who calls the FBI. It's a little bit insane that he had a number for the FBI. Calls the FBI. The FBI agent then drives to the place where the hostage situation is happening, and he's trying to negotiate the freedom of the hostages, but for some reason the TV reporter has the phone number for the house, and so he calls Winston and asks if he'll be done in time for the evening news, I guess so that they can report on it. And so Winston lets them go. Winston had also told the FBI agents that he wanted to be an FBI agent when he was a kid. So then he had 30 years added to his sentence. And then he tried his best to, get parole, to, get released in some way, shape, or form. He even wrote a New York Times op-ed, which again, why he said what he did was actually for the good of everyone, because so many things had been put in place after Kitty's murder. He had earned a bachelor's degree from Niagara University's correspondence school, and he majored in sociology, and he earned straight A's. And then he died in prison on March 28th, 2016, and he was 81. And again, he was the longest serving inmate, I believe, in New York, or at least at that jail. And that's it. What a wild ride. I wanted to give a shout out to a tweet that I saw. I believe it was from Pia Glenn, who talked about some of Kitty Genovese's story, and you were wrong about. Going through the story, there were definitely people who definitely could have and should have done more. When I think about kind of the context of it, you know, not having a central system that you can just call in anonymously to make the report, having cops who barely did anything in general, living on a dark street, everything pretty much being closed in the middle of the night, which is kind of unheard of now for New York City. I think I would have loved to have known more about Kitty Genovese, because she seemed like she was ready to be out here fighting for the gays. We love the gays. And I'm sad that her story got lost in a psychology term, and was also, a lot of it was faked up, I guess, for lack of a better word. I know it's really hard. Like, I have anxiety, so I would be an anxious mess, but try your best to, you know, help people when you think something is wrong. Those New York posters like to say, if you see something, say something. But also, like, make sure that you're not being discriminatory of those people. If you're not vaccinated, get vaccinated and wear masks, because we're not out of it yet. And Kitty, I'm sorry you didn't get the justice you deserved. And I hope that me telling a bit of your story gave you back some of your humanity and justice and identity. I'm sorry you got taken so soon from a really beautiful love. If you see something, say something, but don't be racist or homophobic or transphobic. And cops really need to do a good job, a better job. What are we doing here, buds? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace. We did it. I have 23 minutes before my dentist appointment. Bye! I shouldn't have yelled into the mic. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.